everybody, welcome to episode 10 of Wake Up Call. It's kind of crazy that we've rammed through 10 episodes already. The week off last week, obviously, some unfortunate circumstances happened to me. I had a lot of my belongings stolen, and thus we weren't able to record an episode. But today, we've got a great episode for everyone. We're talking with someone that is a Ukrainian citizen, grew up and lived in Eastern Ukraine until the conflict broke out. That'll be a great and interesting conversation to hear his perspective on the war and the situation in Ukraine. One other thing that I wanted to say, though, before we got started on this topic, is I want to retract something I said last week about Iran and sanctions. I said that basically we should cut off all contact with Iran and, not deal with anything, not deal with their citizens, not deal with their business people, etc., etc. And in retrospect, after hearing the perspectives of a lot of my Iranian friends, I realized that take was just very poorly researched and not something I agree with anymore. So a lot of the feedback I got was basically like, look, you're going to hurt the Iranian citizens, you're going to hurt Iranian businesses. And I mean, Milda challenged me on this in the podcast as well. But I wanted to say that I fully think that opinion was a bit myopic and definitely take that back. I'm always trying to be as accurate and as transparent with my views as possible. So I think it's important to let you know when I change my mind on something, because that's something that, I think that we as a podcast that encourages honest debate should be doing. When you change your mind about something, you should be honest about it, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. So, Milda, do you want to get us started on what we're talking about today?
Yeah, of course. So, of course, we're going to talk about a topic that has been on the news every single day right now, but I think we should still talk about it every single day because people are still dying. The war is not over. And it's very, very heartbreaking every time to hear the perspectives from actually Ukrainian citizens. So it will be very interesting to talk with our guest today. So as all of you know, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine became independent, got their elections, all was maybe from the perspective seemed fine, but Ukraine was never fully apart from Russia. It was still very much influenced by Russia, of course, and we see the effects and results of that today. So we're gonna, before moving into the guest discussion, we just want to give you a very, very brief and quick history of the influence Russia has had on Ukraine, which might have led to the war today. So Vishwa, do you want to begin with that?
Yeah, so I think it's important that we start right at the beginning, which was 1991 as far as Ukraine is concerned. Of course, there's Ukrainian history before that as an independent and free country. But if we start in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union, I think that's an excellent point to see how Ukraine and the modern Russian Federation have always sort of been at odds with each other and have struggled to coexist despite being neighbors and having such a close historical ties. So in 91, basically that marked the end of the Soviet Union when the Ukrainians voted overwhelmingly, 90%, to become an independent democratic country separated from the oligarchic Russian Federation, which had ruled them and abused them for years under the Soviet Union. In 1994, this is very important to note, Ukraine made a deal that they thought would secure their future as a free and independent country. They gave up all of the nuclear weapons that were owned by the former USSR and, of course, had been stationed in Ukraine. They gave all of those weapons up, destroyed them, gave some of them back to Russia, in exchange for Russia to basically leave them alone. In exchange for their sovereignty being guaranteed, Ukraine decided to give up a significant portion of its military arsenal that had been stored there. And of course, as Milda will tell you, throughout the time since 1994, almost 30 years ago now, that sovereignty has not been respected. And of course, right now, what's happening with the Russian invasion is the most egregious example of that. All right, I'm very happy to welcome to the show Oleksii Zahreba. We actually met in the most chance encounter. We both like this YouTuber named JJ McCullough, and he was doing a meet and greet in the Montreal area. and we both hung out and started talking, and I asked him to join me on the show. Thank you so much for joining, Oleksii. So, just to start off, yeah, of course. Just to start off, do you just want to tell your story? Just tell our listeners like who exactly you are, where you come from, and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, for sure. So, as introduced, my name is Alexei, and I live in Canada. I was born in Russia to Ukrainian parents, and I don't remember Russia much at all. I lived there for 5 years, and I've spent majority of my life in Ukraine, in the Donbas region, and where I lived for 10 years. And in 2015, in 2014, I experienced um, the breakaway of those regions from Ukraine, essentially the Russian invasion. I Quite a tumultuous time, and then in 2015 I moved to Canada. I'm currently a student at University of Montreal in the Masters of International Public Affairs.
Okay, so what was that time for you when the separatists sort of began to start the annexation and the war of the eastern regions of Ukraine? Can you just go a little deeper into into that time and like just what was it like?
So perhaps to understand how the war started, would have to go back a few months earlier to focus on the events that unfolded in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine, which were later called the Revolution of Dignity or Euromaidan. So they protested on the Maidan Square, where all the big protests usually happen in Kiev. In 2004, there was a huge protest that was called Orange Revolution, where people were contesting the results of the election. And in 2014, 2013, in December, people came out in support of the trade agreement with the European Union, which our president, Viktor Yanukovych, at the time refused to sign. So for a long time, Viktor Yanukovych was this president who was elected in 2010, and he tried to balance between Russia and European Union, but at some point, he was forced to make a choice, and he was clearly pro-Russian because when you look at the map, the election map of 2010, the eastern regions, most of the Russian-speaking regions, voted for him, and he was himself from Eastern Ukraine, and so when he had to make a decision, he refused to sign the trade agreement with the European Union. That trade agreement was not, of course, Ukraine joining the European Union, but it meant a deeper integration into the European Union trade market, and it meant that Ukraine would build closer ties with the European Union and eventually could potentially join the Union. But the refusal to sign the agreement meant that Ukraine, the policy of the government would be closer ties with Russia, which angered people quite a bit, and they came out on the street. Initially, the protest was small, and at first we thought that it would disintegrate, like many protests that happen in the capital. The capital is always a home to protest, but people come out, voice their opinion, and they leave. What did happen, however, on that at the end of November was decided the fate of the whole protest, because on November 30, riot police, it was late nights, and they came to the Maidan Square and they beat the people who were there. Like they tried to forcibly remove them from there. It was a very strange move from the government, because at that point the protest was um, calming down and people were leaving. And it was a quite violent intervention by the riot police, especially considering there was no riot. It was just people standing there, and most of them were students, most of them were young people. And so the pretext for that was that they had to clear up the Maidan Square to set up a Christmas tree. um, and so which made it even more not nonsensical, because what's the point of beating people just to stop a Christmas tree? And on December 1st, the country saw the videos that on the internet from cameras from security cameras and from people who managed to record this intervention by riot police. And the next day, thousands of people came out on the streets. And I remember watching this on just on the internet on camera, and I was telling my mom, "Come look at the streets of Kiev are full. It's thousands of people marching, and it felt like a historic event to live through, and little we knew that it was only the beginning." And so I would like to put this in the context of what was happening in Eastern Ukraine, because the question is about the separatism and how did the war start. The protest was not supported very much in the Eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine was always a little different from the rest of the country. We spoke Russian at home. I did study in Ukrainian school. We did not identify as Russian, and that's an important distinction to make. There are ethnic Russians who live there. There are also Ukrainians for whom their native language is Russian. So they don't necessarily want to live in Russia, or they identify as Russian, but they do want to use their language at home. And before, that was not really a point of conflict. It was not really something that would stir up conflict. There were like language tension did exist, but no one really minded. Like my family lived without any persecution for us speaking Russian language, and there was always an option to study in the Russian language school. And so the Kiev is so far away when you look at the map that whatever is happening there is like a different world. And so at the time, the protest was not supported in the eastern region, and the people around me, they looked at it as, people did not identify with the idea of joining Europe, because Russia is next door. We have many relatives living there, and we consume their culture, dominant culture. Like here in Canada, we definitely consume a lot of American media just because it's bigger and has a lot more influence. And we in Eastern Ukraine consumed a lot of Russian media because that was created in our language, and it was much more dominant than Ukrainian media. And so the idea of incorporating it to European Union, whereas the border to the European Union is about 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers, like to get, depending on where you want to get to Hungary or Poland. People living closer to Poland and Hungary, to them it's a lot closer. It feels they would go there a lot, and people in Western Ukraine were a lot more supportive of joining the European Union, whereas in Eastern Ukraine people felt ambivalent about it, or outright against it. And so the protest was not supported by people around me, but it was fun to watch. At the time I was in grades, grade 8, I believe, and yeah, grade 8, and me and my classmates would just watch on our phones the pictures and videos from the streets of Kiev, and kind of felt exciting, like this is something big happening. If life is not boring anymore, there's something happening in our country. And so the protest continued for December and January, and later things started to get violent. There were it was a big protest, thousands of people, and police had to step up their efforts to police the area, and there was a lot of tension, and I was not at the protest, but when you look at the pictures from that time, you could see that standoff between police and the people. And the topic of Euromaidan, this whole protest, is a subject in its own. We could do a separate podcast on it. But towards I don't remember the exact dates, towards the February, this things started to get violent. There were first death. Unfortunately, people were getting injured, and they're because of police brutality. And it started like feeling that it's not gonna end well, because the initial idea why people came out on the street is to voice their opinion against the government that did not sign the trade agreement with the European Union. In December, January, the goal changed. People were demanding the government to step down. Now that's a whole different scale of the protest. Before it was, we don't like the policy of the government. Now it turns out we don't like the government at all. We want you to leave. And Viktor Yanukovych, he tried to hold it together, and the protest had opposition leaders. Why later people studied why the protest was successful. Well, it was not just the people in the street. The people had representation in the parliament. The people supported actual politicians who could potentially, if there was a power vacuum, they could step in, which what happened in February. So on February 21st, I believe, or 22nd, there was an agreement struck down between the president, the government, and the protest that to calm down the protesters, there would be Yanukovych would fulfill certain demands, and it felt, and I remember that the ambassadors of certain EU countries and United States were mediating in those negotiations. And so that was such a fleeting moment because we saw the news that agreement was reached between the protesters and between the government. And the next day, it felt like watching a movie because the next day President fled the country, like he left Ukraine. And after that, it was developing very, very fast. So before I was talking on the scale of months. So from now on, I will be talking on the scale of days because every single day was important. And so in February, the president simply fled the country. He recorded his last video in Kharkiv, another eastern region of Ukraine. And then reports said that he fled the country by car via Crimea. And this is where things start get really interesting because certain militia groups wanted to kill him. And so the reports say that he narrowly escaped death there when he was driving away from Crimea towards Russia. And so next week, the country woke up to the fact that the president has fled the country. There's no president literally. And the parliament of Ukraine voted to impeach him. The procedure was not done quite right. Like they did not have enough votes they didn't reach the vote threshold to properly carry out the impeachment. And this is the point that Russia will be using much later, that this was a violent revolution and takeover of the government. This was illegal, and military junta, or how they're referred, is now ruling in Kiev. And they would be prosecuting, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and we need to save them. This is their main line in their propaganda, which worked quite effectively because at that point, what's really interesting about living in that time is the emotions run so high and there's so much tension that facts sometimes do not matter because people simply pick a side and they stand on that side because of their ideology, and whatever you tell them, they won't change their mind. So a lot of people in Eastern Ukraine, felt like this is real, that the government change is now means that we will actually be, our rights will be limited, speaking Russian. And every word in that, when the atmosphere is so sort of like it feels electrical, there is with such high tensions, it feels like any word, any speech, anything that's said wrong can just start these dominoes falling. So they voted to impeach him. They did not reach the right amount of votes, but they did it anyway because, well, the president fled the country. There's really nothing else to do. And caretaker presidents, a temporary president, the interim president took over, and they set election date for May, and that should have been the end of that, if Russia did not intervene. So at that point, this is a crucial point where the president is impeached. The revolution succeeded. This was high points of Euromaidan. People stood there and they brought down the government. It was unfortunately only happened after about 100 deaths. 100 people died during the protest, and it still has not been discovered to this day what really happened there because it's a fact that there were snipers on the roof on that square. Where did the snipers come from? Who ordered them to strike? Who ordered them to shoot innocent people? We don't know to this day. But again, as any revolution, as any like big protest, it's messy. It's not that black and white. Sometimes there's a lot of sides, a lot of hurt feelings, and when it gets violent, people dying because of this, it's inevitably the people themselves sort of become victims of propaganda later, like they're just used as props. So to this day, it was a turning point in Ukrainian history, of course. And again, if Russia had not intervened, this would probably have been the end of it. Because yes, in Eastern Ukraine, clearly did not like that. What happened in Kiev, across Ukraine, there were different protests in support of Euromaidan, so they were happening at the same time. Eastern Ukraine did not have that. There was a couple of memes going around how like there's a protest there and protest there, and then they show security camp from Donetsk, and it's just empty. So no one showed up. It felt like the end, but I was only the beginning because then Russia started the process of sending their troops to Crimea. So Crimea has been an autonomous region since Ukraine separated from Soviet Union, and it was quite clear that Russia did not really like that setup. Um, they considered it their region, and what's different from Eastern Ukraine where I lived is majority of people in Eastern Ukraine identified as Ukrainians, even though they're Russian speaking. Now, majority in Crimea identified as ethnic Russians, and there were quite a lot of Ukrainians living there, but also a lot of ethnic Russians. And so immediately after the government changed in Kiev, um, something started stirring up in Crimea, and it was definitely the point where Russian government felt this is the right moment. This is where Ukraine at its weakest point. Just after the revolution, we have to take advantage of it. And everything else that has been happening in Crimea after that was shown in Russia as, people reclaiming their destiny. They want to be back to Russia. And there was clearly like a lot of people supporting in Crimea, supporting the joining Russia. And they there was definitely a popular support of that, but it's hard to measure how much exactly they supported. And later, when the troops entered, they entered Crimea, Russian troops on February 27th. So next day, the whole world sees these people who were not identified as Russians. They did not wear any signs. They did not wear. It was impossible to tell who they are. It was quite clear that they're from Russia, but they did not say we are Russian army. And so then they're standing there, and then the local government in Crimea announces this referendum to join Russia. And so it's organized quite quickly, and then people vote with military standing in the street. So yes, it is people expressing their will, but when you go vote with when you go to the ballots to the booth to put your ballot in, and there's like a soldier standing nearby. They're not exactly telling you how to vote, but Crimea voted overwhelmingly to join Russia. I will not talk about Crimea much because I'm not from there, so I can't really talk on their behalf and what they feel like. Clearly, a lot of people definitely believe that life would be better joining Russia in Crimea, and because Ukraine has not exactly been a successful country during the period of its independence. It's a like lower middle income country in Europe. A lot of people left abroad, a lot of people immigrated for a better life. And so it felt like Russia was definitely richer, thanks to its oil and gas industry. And a lot of Crimeans definitely felt that they could improve something by leaving Ukraine. Now, where it extends to us, the Eastern Ukrainians, this was the point where a lot of people saw what happened in Crimea, and there was this feeling there, well, we can do it too. Russia would welcome us back in because we speak Russian here, and the way it happened in Crimea, if we host our own referenda here, we can join Russia just like that too, just like Crimea joined Russia in 2 weeks. And so this is where separatists have started their movement. So in terms of how I felt being there, it's definitely like being grade 10, being grade 8 and 14. We could understand, like me and my classmates could understand the full scale of what was happening, how much it mattered, the politics of it, because a lot of people were repeating whatever the parents would tell them. At that age, like there's not much of a personal opinion. It's heavily influenced by like your relatives, your family. But we did feel like it was something we would never see in our lifetime again. We were seeing something historic, and it turned definitely historic, like in terms of Ukraine, in terms of Russia, and in terms of all our personal lives. I know all my classmates, their lives changed quite drastically after that spring, after February, March of 2014.
Yeah, that's such a compelling story. Thank you so much. You answered a lot of our follow-up questions as well, so we don't have to ask about them. But I wanted to talk about the referendums as well. Right now, recently, referendums also happened in Eastern Ukraine. And of course, Russia is saying that the majority of the citizens, like up to 95% of Ukrainian citizens, want to join Russia, while of course the Ukrainian authorities are saying that that is incorrect, since so many people, like 80% of the pre-war inhabitants, have either left Ukraine as refugees or have become just displaced internally. So how should the international arena really judge these referendums and believe, the free will of the people, as you said, when there's literally the military standing outside with a gun and forcing you to sort of vote in a way?
Any kind of vote, any referendum at this point, how many referendums were there? With three in 2014, Crimea joining Russia, two Luhansk, Donetsk and Luhansk separating from Ukraine, and then now we had Luhansk, Donetsk again, Zaporizhia, Kherson, so four. 7 referenda at this point since 2014. Every single one of them was illegal. It was not done in accordance with the Ukrainian authorities. The perhaps even looking back, perhaps referenda in Russia could be seen as the most legitimate because yeah, Russia, people residents of Crimea felt strongly about joining Crimea, joining Russia. Perhaps not at the numbers that Russia posted, like over 90% joining Russia. It's hard to understand the actual public support just because of censorship there and trying to run any poll that would be reflective of what people think is pretty much impossible because there's certainly a um, well on the peninsula on Crimean Peninsula the way Russian media work and the way people sort of behave themselves after Russia annexed them. It's they understood that essentially was turned into a military base, and so their opinion doesn't matter as much here. So it's the same as following Russians in Russia. Do you support war in Ukraine? Well, when someone calls you and says, like usually these polls done by phone, like someone calls you and say, "Do you support war in Ukraine?" Like just being there and record like it's who someone called you and asked you this like what are you gonna say? It's probably yes or like I will or drop the phone. So any referendum should be taken should not be taken seriously. It's seen, especially the recent one there, it's definitely Russia's weakness because they announced they host referendums. They announced that yes, all these people want to join Russia. It becomes Russia like literally next week, and then Ukrainian army continues advancement, and they took over the villages that were Russian just yesterday. So Russia's borders changed already, just a couple of days after referendum, and it's the whole world sees what it is. It is for what it is, and um, I don't. There's virtually almost no country that recognizes it as legitimate expression of people's will. We also need to be careful when there are suggestions. What if we hold the actual referendum? Like legitimate referendum. What do we have? Ukrainian authorities. We have UN. United Nations observers from European Union. Russian observers can come and we host the most legitimate referendum and see what actual people think. It seems like a good solution to this whole situation, but it's been 8 years since 2014, and Russia has sent quite a lot of people to live there in Crimea, for example, and a lot of people from Russia also live in those regions. So the situation is really not the same. It's a lot of people who are not even natives of the region who would be voting in that. So it's a mess created and perpetrated by Russia, and it's really hard to get out of it. And this is, I always say there won't be really any easy solution to this, and this war will be remembered for generations, and there will be a lot of hate between people for like probably the rest of the century because of this.
Yeah, that's the Elon Musk sort of solution that you were talking about, and just doesn't make any sense, especially given that these regions, I mean, the sovereignty of one country cannot be dictated by the imperial wills of another. That needs to be something that is decided internally. And if Russia's pressuring Ukraine to imagine if America pressured Quebec to have a referendum to join them or something related to that, it's obviously no country would see that as legitimate. So I want to move a little bit away from the sort of bigger picture conflict based stuff and talk more about you personally. So what was the process that ended up with you coming to Canada? How did that work?
We lived, so my family stayed in the Donetsk region occupied by Russian forces, pro-Russian forces. A lot of newspapers refer them to pro-Russian or self-proclaimed republics, which is the funniest one. Like, they were not self-proclaimed. Russia helped them a lot to proclaim themselves. But yeah, we lived in that territory, claimed and controlled by pro-Russian forces, by so-called republics, and we stayed there until the end of 2014. And after that, we moved to same region. We stayed within the region, but we moved to Ukrainian controlled territory. So it's a story of how you look back at countries and regions that were split because of politics. There was Germany and there was Korea, and now it's Eastern Ukraine. All these 8 years, there was a demarcation line, which happened as a result of the war. Ukrainian army managed to take some territory back, and originally, though, there were attempts in those cities the republics claimed the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and an Ukrainian army counterattacked, and it was really interesting at the time because it was a very weak separatist movement in the beginning. And where Ukrainians were fast to act, they were managed to take those villages back. And so we remained within the region. We moved to the Ukrainian controlled territory, and that territory has never really, during the spring of 2014, they never really saw the war. There was this peace whole time, and it was so absurd because some of the fate of those villages, and it was not a small town where we lived, were removed to the fate was decided just because a few dozen policemen or people from Ukrainian security service were fast to react to separatist movement and shut it down. And for the next 8 years, the city lived in peace. And so we moved back, and it was completely different world, from living under the so-called republic to living under Ukraine. I stayed there for almost the entirety of 2015, where I completed grade 9. My uncle, who still lives in Edmonton, Alberta, suggested that I move to Canada for a year to study and to sort of take this as opportunity to move away from that chaos. And it's been an idea for a long time, so of his, that I could come to Canada and study English and learn English language and see the life abroad. And we discussed this, while we were being refugees. That was 2014, as we moved, and my mom, my sister, and I, we moving around, trying, waiting for the war to be over. We thought it would be over in a few months. But at the time, my mom talked to me and said, well, we thought of this idea, and like, what do you think? So at the time I was 14, and I said, well, we are currently refugees, and there's literally nothing to hold on to here. So it makes sense to go elsewhere. I don't have anything to lose. I'm very young, and it took quite a bit of time to prepare the documents, the student visa and the rest of things to apply for visa to get approved. So it took a year. We made the decision, I remember, in August 2014, and my visa was approved in September of 2015. And I received the visa in September 2015, and the idea was that I would go to a public school in Edmonton, and I would just live with my uncle, and that would be life. But then he found a private school in between Edmonton and Calgary. It was a Christian school. It's part of the denomination of which my dad works for, and it's called Seventh-day Adventist Church, and it's they have a huge school system around the world. So perhaps I should have mentioned it earlier on. The job of my dad was being a religious minister, and that's what he's been doing his whole life. He studied has 2 theology degrees, and the church we're part of, and the church he works for has a huge school system around the world, second only to Catholic system, surprisingly. And there was a school in between Edmonton and Calgary, located in a small town called Lacombe. And my uncle simply talked to them, and he said, well, there's this guy, and he's a kid of the minister, and they were refugees, and they had to leave their town. And is there any possibility for him to study there? And they said we can look at this, and they accepted me. And the plans changed quite quickly. From me, the idea of studying from public school in Edmonton turned into living in a small town and studying at a private boarding school. And that's how I came to Canada. I landed in Edmonton on November 5th, 2015. And a week later, I headed to that school where I ended up staying not for 1 year, but for 3 years. And I completed high school there.
Wow, that is such a compelling story. Just to follow up on something that you said there, your mom and sister didn't join you in Canada. Are they still living in Ukraine?
As we're
And your
recording this
dad,
podcast,
sorry.
yeah. So as we're recording this podcast, a lot of things have changed. Even if we recorded this 1 year ago, I would be talking about how this conflict has been on for many years now. We don't see an end to it. We don't think there will be an end to it, and a lot of things can change within a short period of time. And the lives of my family have turned upside down since the invasion in February this year. As we speak, as we record this podcast, my mom and sister are in the state of Oregon, in the United States, where my sister will be also studying at a Christian academy, which belongs to the network of our church schools. They were um, um, kind enough to launch this sort of program for Ukrainian students, Ukrainian refugees. I saw a group picture of them. I think there's about 20 students, Ukrainian students, in that school. So my sister is part of them, and she'll be beginning in grade 10, starting with this Monday. And my mom is traveling back to Canada after that. And my dad is currently in Ukraine. He continues to work. He's no longer a minister, but he works more of an administration position in the church, and he does ministry there. And it's not the life in Ukraine is quite terrible at the moment, because living next to a crazy neighbor who continues to randomly bomb, residential buildings and residential quarters. Um, at any given moment, there can be a rocket can land in any city, in any village. There's no logic to it. So the life there is not great, and people unfortunately are getting used to it, and I feel like the world is getting used to it. And so my dad is currently there, and they do follow these protocols for when there's error alert, like that government alerts people that something can potentially fall very soon, but people kind of stop caring about it. And when the actual attack strikes, people die, and it's not something the world should be getting used to, and there should be as much help as possible towards Ukraine so the Ukraine can protect themselves from Russia.
For sure. I mean, it's very good to hear that your family is safe. Your dad is obviously still in Ukraine, but we really hope that he stays safe. We also wanted to hear a bit more about what you think about the reactions of the world to this war. For example, where I'm from in Lithuania, also from Eastern Europe, since the war started, there has definitely been hate crimes against Russians and just a very big reaction against Russian citizens as a whole, not only Putin's regime. I mean, Poland and Baltic states even enacted a visa ban for Russian citizens, while the EU made it harder for them to obtain visas overall. So what do you think of this? Like, should the world arena be blaming all Russians or only Putin's regime?
This is a complicated topic. Sometimes I think of it in terms of alternative reality. What would have happened if my parents did not leave Russia? Because I was born there, and I could have been eligible for Russian citizenship. What would happen if we were on the other side of the border right now? We would have been living in Russia and watching this, and we would be, Ukrainians still. Like, we have Ukrainian roots. You have Ukrainian citizenship, but at the same time, we're living in Russia. What do we do? And I understand the first reaction of many Ukrainians to blame Russians for their inactivity or activity in this case. Like, their silence and their words, blame for anything they do. There are a lot of emotions, angry emotions, and it's really hard, of course, to be rational when the bombs are falling on you and your Russian relatives cannot do much. Because I speak in terms of relatives because a lot of people, it's a reality of, um, of people having families in Russia and friends in Russia and um, uh, just being able to interact with them and them being people in Russia being helpless in face of this. The leaders of the Western countries took this position at the beginning of the war. They emphasized multiple times that this is not Russia's people's war, this is Putin's war. And they explicitly said, that I remember Boris Johnson recording like his speech in Russian. I do not believe this war is on behalf of your name. He was speaking in Russian. And it was a good position to take because blaming Russians for for the war only strengthens the internal Russian propaganda, where they say we're not fighting against Ukraine, we're fighting against the collective West, and that empowers people and that empowers propaganda to say, see, they hate you, they absolutely hate you for being Russian, and they continue to use that. They say they cherry pick whatever happens to Russians. There are definitely hate crimes happening in Europe towards Russia, and they use that. See, like there is Russophobia, and they do not like you. This is therefore this war against Ukraine is justified because it's not just about Ukraine; it's about fighting against the collective West. And we shouldn't blame Russians for whatever is happening right now. It's important to understand it's easy to say, well, why don't you go and start a revolution against Putin? Putin has been tightening the grip on power for over 20 years, and now he's holding it very firmly. There's no indication that he will go down anytime soon, unless there's some sort of palace coup. Russians they will have to deal with this. This will be their problem. How did they allow this to happen? How did they make it to the point of their government starting a war against neighbor nation, and Russians cannot do anything about this. This is their internal problem to deal with because they will have to ask this question: why did we allow our country to become like this? So that's not our problem, and we can't tell them what to do. I don't know, the future between Ukrainians and Russian at this point. There won't be, a lot of people have always felt, have always had good feelings, kind feelings towards the Russians, and there's always this talk of us being brothers, sisters, whatever you call it, siblings. And I can't definitely say that the relationship has not been equal. Russians had not viewed us as equal siblings. It's kind of like older sibling and the younger siblings, like, I don't know, 10, 15 years younger, totally different life that sibling is having. And Russians definitely look down on Ukrainians a lot. I do remember traveling to Russia and speaking Russian there, and people say, well, that's not real Russian. You're speaking some kind of regional Russian. What's this accent? They being really posh about it. And, in Moscow, there are people um, uh, who look down on regional accents, and Russian is my native language. I'm sorry, I speak it the way I learned to do it in childhood. So I do not blame individual Russians. I still have family living there, and it is. I do feel sometimes it's a first instinct to blame them, because just to blame someone for it, just to say, well, why call them and say why you're not doing anything. But I do have to think of myself over alternative reality where I am on that side of the border in Russia, and my Ukrainian relative calls me and say, well, Oleksii, why are you not doing anything? This is your fault. At the same time, there's a certain problem with our relatives and friends sort of being ambivalent about it and not even checking in to see how we are. Like maybe because of guilt, maybe because of the sense of hopelessness. Russians have a different mentality. They won't call you or text you like Americans would do, or Canadians would do. Just if even if they cannot do anything, at least they'll ask you how are you doing. And Russians won't do that, because if they can't do anything, well, might as well not even ask, not even reach out. So there are these mentality characteristics of their mentality, which is okay, which is just different from what I'm used to, for example, in Canada. So yeah, to sum up the answer to your question, individual Russians should not be blamed, but I can understand the policy of neighboring nations. When Germany does not want to entirely prohibit Russians entering Germany. Germany is not bordering Russia, so it's completely different reality that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania have to live in, and Poland when they are bordering Russia. So whatever their national politics are, I can't comment much on this because I do not live there.
Oleksii, I think that just about wraps things up. I really just want to reiterate how thankful we are that you agreed to come on our show. Your insights, both as a student of international relations, someone that's clearly educated on this subject, and just your personal experience as a Russian-speaking Eastern Ukrainian that feels a strong identity with Ukraine, is just, I think, super insightful. I felt that I learned a whole lot today. And again, just thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. I was glad to share my perspective, and hopefully it helps viewers to understand the station is a little bit more. The foreign wars are always complex. It does feel like there's this whole station to untangle. There's so much happening, and sometimes it's difficult for me. Like, I have been away from there, and I don't really identify, like, I don't understand Ukrainian culture sometimes because I've been away from them, and what they talk about can be a little foreign to me. So even I can lose understanding of it. So not to speak of regular Canadians and other US Euro podcasts who just want to understand what's happening. But I hope I was helpful. I hope I was helpful, and it helped your listeners to gain additional insight into this war.
Yeah, you definitely were helpful. Again, thank you so much, and take care.
So that is it, you guys, for episode 10. We really hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. It was a pleasure having our guest. And don't forget to follow us on all social media, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and we will see you all next week. Goodbye.